start talking about this particular topic, Hydronic 101 and pressure distribution, I like to start it off with a little debate about, well, why do we need an expansion tank? You know, perhaps we could set up a system where it wouldn't be necessary. Let's talk about that. What I'm going to do is draw a little schematic up here on the board. And it's important too to make the distinction that we are talking about closed loop hydronic systems here, as opposed to say something like an open condenser water system. So this is essentially a sealed system, and that's what I'm drawing a schematic up here. I've got some kind of a boiler and a pump and some kind of a closed loop. Now, like I said, what I like to do is kind of have a little debate here about, well, do we really need this expansion tank? Well, let's think about this. Let's say that this particular closed loop hydronic system had 1,000 gallons of water in it. Well, what happens when we heat that water? Let's say we're going to heat it from 60 to 180 degrees. Well, what happens to that water? It's going to expand. About how much? When you heat water from 60 to 180, it expands about 2.75%. So if we take this 1,000 gallons of water, we multiply it out by 2.75%, that's 27.5 gallons of additional water that we'll have when the system gets heated up. Well, in the absence of some kind of relief valve, water, essentially incompressible, the pressure, even with a couple of degrees elevation here, will literally spike like crazy. So what would happen here, if we heat the system, we would literally break something in the system. Something's going to break. Those pressures are going to spike like crazy. So typically what's done to deal with that would be some kind of a relief valve. Or one thing that I could do to deal with this is put a relief valve on there. Now I'll set this particular relief valve at 30 psig, so when it sees something higher than that pressure on the inside of the system, it's going to start dumping water. So in this scenario I just set up here, I've got a hydronic system, and as I heat it up and that water expands, I'll just dump it. So by the time I get done heating this thing up, I'll have dumped 27.5 gallons. Well, there's a way of setting this system up where I didn't require an expansion tank. But the problem would be, what happens when I cool this system back down? Back down to, say, 60 degrees or something lower. Now I'm going to be short water. Well, I've got a solution for that. I can hook a PRV up to this system. I can't hook this system up directly to city water because it's typically 60 or 80 psig coming in. So I'll put this PRV on there, and I'll set it for 15 pounds. So what happens is, as my system cools and my pressure drops, I will feed water in. Once my pressure drops below 15 pounds, I'll start feeding water in, and I'll make up that water that I lost. So as my hydronic system cycles between hot and cold, typically that happens once or so a day, I'll dump water when I'm heating it up and add some water when I'm cooling it down. So literally, I've come up with a scenario here between a PRV and a relief valve where I could really avoid using any kind of expansion tank. Well, turns out that this is a really bad idea for a hydronic system to run like this. There's 3 really compelling reasons why I would never want to do this. So the first of those is pretty obvious. If you think about systems and chemical treatment that we put in them, sometimes we use a glycol mixture in there for freeze protection. My goodness, if we were dumping that down the drain every time we heated and cooled the system up, glycol, 5-gallon pail of that stuff can be $100 easy. So that would be a lot of money down the drain. So loss of chemical treatment or glycol would be a compelling reason why this would not be a good scenario. It turns out there's a couple other reasons that make this a really bad idea to run a system like this, and they have to do with things that come in with that makeup water. Well, the first one has to do with the fact that we make these systems out of steel pipe. And when you have hot water, steel pipe, and oxygen that's coming in with your fresh water, you've got a lot of corrosion. So oxygen being continuously brought into the system is a bad idea. Causes a lot of corrosion, and that's one reason why we don't want to get into this scenario where we're constantly adding fresh water to the system. We want to get the oxygen out, keep it out. So that's Number 2 reason. The third is sort of an interesting substance that happens to be dissolved in our fresh water. And it has an unusual characteristic in that it becomes less soluble in water as we get hotter. That's very unusual. Most substances don't react like that. If you think about trying to stir sugar into iced tea, it's pretty hard. Stirring sugar into hot tea, pretty easy. But this particular substance, known as calcium carbonate, sometimes referred to as lime or scale, this doggone stuff becomes less soluble as the water gets hotter. And it likes to play down in the worst possible place, which is the boiler. So the sections in there will end up getting a layer of lime and scale that builds up over time. And that insulates those heat transfer surfaces, making them less efficient. But also you end up in a scenario where that heat transfer metal in the boiler has to get hotter and hotter to drive the heat through there. That puts a lot of stress on it. In a cast iron style boiler, we often would see sections that would crack and fail as a result of all that lime and scale. So, very important that we keep that fresh water out of our hydronic system for all those 3 reasons. All right? And this essentially is the job of an expansion tank, right? I like to say there's 2 jobs. Number 1, we have to provide what's known as an acceptance volume. Now, what does that mean? That means that we have to have somewhere for that water that's expanded to hang out while that system's hot. And then when that system cools back down, that water's there to be reintroduced back in the hydronic water or hydronic system. So I keep the same water in the system. So that's acceptance volume. But I also need an air cushion as a part of that expansion tank that's strategically sized to allow us to maintain our system within the pressures that are set up. So if my fill pressure is 15 pounds, my relief pressure is 30, I need to have an air cushion that's sized large enough so that it can handle the acceptance of that 27.5 gallons of water without letting the pressures elevate above that. So that is the job of the expansion tank. That's why it's important. That's why we need it. So the next thing we'll do is talk about some of the different styles of expansion tanks, how they work, and how they do their job.